I am Jim Collison and live from our virtual studios around the world, or at least here in the Midwest today. This is Gallup's Call to Coach, recorded on November 20th, 2020. Call to Coach is a resource for those who want to help others discover and use their strengths. We have Gallup experts and independent strengths coaches share tactics, insights, and strategies to help coaches maximize the talent of individuals, teams, and organizations around the world. If you're listening live, we would love to have you join us on our live platform. Actually, right above me on our live page is a link to the YouTube page. There's a chat room embedded in there. Many have made their way over there to get that done. About 21 of you watching and in the chat room. But we'd love to have you there. Click on that link, head over there, sign into the chat room. If you have questions after the fact, you can always send us an email, coaching@gallup.com. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube while you're there. There's a subscribe button over in the corner. And of course, you can always listen to us as a podcast. Just search Gallup Webcasts on any podcast app. We have two great guests today. Marisa Ortiz is an artist and entrepreneur serving clients as a intercultural talent development consultant. Marissa, that sounds super important. She educates visionary leaders and mission-driven organizations by bringing people in multicultural workplaces through the customized training programs that facilitating workshops on performance skills, integrating a strengths-based culture. Marissa, welcome to Call to Coach.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
So great to have you. I'll introduce also Sean Attwood. He serves as a vice president of business development at the San Antonio Economic Development Foundation, using a talent-driven economic development approach to attract high-paying jobs to the San Antonio region. Sean leverages nearly 20 years of combined experience. Sean, I wouldn't have guessed that by looking at you, in previous information technology and workforce development roles to identify opportunities to broaden access to training for San Antonio residents that prepare them for digital jobs while simultaneously making the pitch to growth stage companies to locate jobs to San Antonio. Sean, welcome to Call to Coach.
Thanks for having me. I just want to let you know I'm experiencing a lot of gratitude for even being here today because I've always been a big fan of the strengths movement. So thank you.
Yeah, it's good to have you both. Marissa, let's start with you. That was a big impressive intro, but I always ask folks, like, what do you really do? So if you talk a little bit about your role, like from your perspective, give us your top five and just maybe a little bit of background on you before we get started.
Sure. Thank you. My top 5 strengths are connectedness, input, learner, empathy, and positivity. And I am a talent development consultant or learning and development employee training consultant. I've been doing it for around 5 years. Serving clients in different industries. And what I do is I offer strengths-based courses. The majority of my work is in employee training, team training, and of course, the vast majority of my work is through strengths. So what I love to do is to customize the curriculum to a specific target. What is it that you want to do with strengths, not just the strengths class or the strengths finders class, as you know, still a lot of people recognize it as Strengths Finder. And yes, and of course I do coaching. I am a Gallup certified strengths coach. I was trained in Gallup DC in the fall of 2014. And then became certified by January of 2015. And I've been very blessed to keep my certification and keep doing strengths work. So yes, that's what I do. And prior to my consulting and being a business owner, entrepreneur, the gig economy, you name it, in the digital era, of course, I worked for a strengths-based organization, a strengths-based IT company. That's where I really became acquainted and actually trained. I worked in the HR department as a trainer for the majority of my 8 years that I worked there. So I had a lot of opportunity to work with mainly IT professionals through their strengths in the hundreds, because this was a company like many others in IT that had a huge growth, and we were in the HR training department, we were having new employee orientations of 120 people per month. And they had to be brought into the company culture, strengths-based company culture. So I did a lot of work that I felt that helped me sharpen my saw But then I didn't start working outside of that organization until 2015. So that's what I do. I call myself, thank you for your feedback. I think global, but I implement very local, obviously, here in San Antonio, Texas. And it took me a long time with this input of mine to come up with how I'm going to brand myself. I've been very blessed as a consultant to have organic work, someone that saw me, us trainers are very, on stage, right? We are the vocalist of the band. So I got, very blessed to one gig led me to another. So it took me some time to kind of like finalize the name that I wanted to brand myself. And I just recently actually got my domain and have my website. But Intercultural Talent, I decided to call it that way because what I am passionate about is connecting people from different cultures and through strengths, to the universal language of talent. And I think just strengths does it's the only tool that I use proudly. Because not only because of its credentials, obviously, and the amazing work that you guys do at Gallup in research, but because the results are there, and you see it in different industries and different sectors. You see, how humans react to reading their reports for the first time and how the conversation dramatically changes when we start talking about our talents. So that's what I do. And my passion is bridging people in multicultural workplaces. I love working with diverse audiences. I speak some Brazilian Portuguese, to your earlier point, and I speak, decent French. And I'm originally from Mexico, so I also work in Spanish.
Yeah.
I'm here in San Antonio, Texas, but I do a lot of work in Espanol as well. So that's what I do in a nutshell.
What's your favorite, if you had to kind of pick one thing about the favorite part of your job right now, what is that?
Wow, what is my favorite? Probably connecting, like in the pandemic, right, that we're going through in this COVID reality. Of course, it was hard for me not to see people in person, with connectedness and empathy, right? In my top 5, I am addicted to looking at people's faces. Like on Zoom, and I bring in like a co-facilitator friend to help me with chat rooms because I just cannot stop looking at people. So what I really enjoy in 2020 is being able to have a close-up of the individuals that I am talking to without the distractions of the outside world. And just really enjoying the moment. And I realized like what a blessing and, what a connectedness statement. But, what are the odds in the universe that, in this moment, I'm having this amazing conversation. So that's what I enjoy the most, that, traveling has become irrelevant. That technology, we can be anywhere, in any part of the world at any time and connect.
Yeah, no, for sure. The world got smaller as we all went home and we got these opportunities. We've been doing this on Called to Coach for 8 years. And so we like to think of ourselves as pioneers kind of in that. But Marissa,
Absolutely.
thanks for coming on. Sean, let me ask you the same question. Vice President of Economic Development sounds super important, but what do they really pay you to do? Like, what's your job and what's your role there?
Yeah, no, good question. So I'll start with my top 5: individualization, input, futuristic, connectedness, and learner. And those top 5 really help me do my job. So economic development really is a team sport. So, at the EDF, we are charged with the responsibility of leading the messaging and much of the workforce development components that go into building a city that is producing talent, and not just merely expecting to import talent. Even though we've been getting noticed lately and we're enjoying that, we play a really big role in bringing together, the community that represents K through 12, the community colleges, the universities, the large employers in town, from all different industries, and create the conditions so that high-paying jobs will continue to flourish here in San Antonio, but also that we create the conditions that attract high-paying jobs and investments in San Antonio. what's interesting is economic development, has been going on for decades and decades in major cities, and our organization is about 45 years old. But we're going through an interesting time right now in society, and you see a lot of change in this space, and I expect to see a lot of disruption and innovation in this space. And really what it comes down to is ensuring that everybody has access, or at least we find where the barriers might be a little bit higher, and create equitable access so that folks can, access the training and the other conditions that allow them to become certified to get high-paying jobs, or to become entrepreneurs, and to seek out the resources needed so that they can take risks and they can find opportunities for basically having a good life, right? So, an example of the workforce development work that we do is we go out there and we seek gaps that might exist between the local education system, going all the way K through 12, and ensuring that we're filling those gaps by creating internship programs, apprenticeship programs, linking them to everyone from students to adults to young adults to dislocated workers that want to make a career change. God knows there's a lot of that opportunity right now, and I don't say that lightly. So that's a major component, is that workforce development piece. But then the other piece that, it's a little bit more sexy, but it's going through disruption right now, is we get to sell the city of San Antonio. And that's a lot of fun as somebody who grew up here and absolutely loves it here. It's a big decision when companies decide that they need to go to a new market, whether they relocate or expand. And so we provide a lot of data. We use that data to help folks, make decisions on what cities they'd like to evaluate. And our goal at the end of that process is to end up on the short list by proving that we have the type of city where a company can come establish themselves. People want to live here. People want to work here. We have a sense of place here, allowing individuals and companies to build wealth here. And every city has its own philosophy on what's important to its society. And I'd like to say that San Antonio is a very inclusive and a very equity conscious city. And so you'll see in many of the programs that we have here in San Antonio, they really do look closely at the individual, the family, some of the interconnected barriers that might get in the way of prosperity. And really as a team of a county government, city government, local nonprofits, San Antonio Economic Development Foundation, academia, K through 12, we all work together to stay on top of those most pressing issues and find solutions to solve them.
That's impressive, Sean. What's your favorite thing to do each day? Why do you wake up in the morning?
So my favorite thing to do, so I'm a real big strengths nerd. And if you asked me 15 years ago if I was going to be doing this kind of work, I'd say I wish, because intuitively it connects to what I know is real now. And this is a people business. I mean, you really do have to value the individual, right? You have to remove biases, and you have to understand that there's opportunity with everybody, right? And so the individualization's my top. Connectedness, I think, is number 4. And but sometimes I feel like connectedness leads me, and but if it leads me to a basement, I might have to suppress it a little bit. But I do geek out on the fact that I do believe that we are all connected within just a couple of degrees of separation. And that said, there are many folks that are interested in this type of work. But my favorite thing about this type of work is finding those organizations, finding that energy, finding that funding that goes towards the greater cause of building a community. And there's so many elements that go on in the background. When I used to work a typical 9-to-5 job for a great company, I had no idea. You just think, oh, the schools run the way they run, businesses come and go. And, funding is used for mostly roads and things like that. But there's actually a lot of work that goes into preparing young folks, adults, mid-career folks, all the like, in ensuring that they have really multiple pathways and there's no wrong door to success. And so I like the fact that our job is never the same every single day. but the vision is clear, and it's about building community, and being a part of that is amazing.
Thanks for that intro.
Yeah.
Sean. Marissa, you beat Sean at connectedness. You have it 1. Sean has it 4. So I'm going to ask you this question. Why are you guys connected? What's the partnership there between the two of you?
Sure. Well, we worked at the same strengths-based organization. I was there for 8 years. And Sean, you were there for 11 years, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, about 11 and a half years.
11 and a half years. So that's where we connected. And coincidentally, I was working as a trainer, and I had the privilege to interview Sean for a position. And I was just blown away with the depth of his answers, because I was a teacher in the room, right? The one teaching the theory behind the roles and behind the teams and how the work should be done because of the systems, yada, yada, yada. But I was disconnected from the business, right? Because I was in the training room. I was training. And I just remember feeling, listening to Sean and listening. I mean, intellection, that's what comes to my mind when I think of Sean, of a very profound thinker. And ever since that day, I became a fan. So, we continued to bump into each other in the business, in different things. And after I left, of course, through social media, we kept in touch. And the universe has brought us together in other areas of our lives. Personally, we're part of the community. So I consider Sean my friend, and it's a beautiful serendipity that we get to continue partnering together after all these years. Oh my gosh, yes.
Sean,
it's very nice of you.
Sean, I can't leave you
it's like so nice
with you having connectedness as well. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, gosh, what can I say? Geez, I feel embarrassed. That's so nice of you to say, Marissa. But I mean, the feeling's mutual. Look, I mean, that saying, real recognizes real, right? And that happens in our lives. And there's just certain people that you stay in touch with because, you connect on maybe ideological things, or, maybe you have the same, mutual friends. I know we have a lot of mutual friends. And that's just part of what makes it exciting to get up every day, whether you're thinking about you're focused on family only today, or I've got a heavy career day, or or I'm on this amazing podcast. There's always going to be quality connections that are paying attention or waiting, and not in vain, for that next opportunity for you to discover something new, learn a new insight, use a different perspective to leverage your own. And that's really what strengths is all about. And so, I'm a big nerd about this stuff to the point where I'm still trying to figure out what to do as a coach, because I got certified as a coach, but I haven't gotten into it to the level of Marissa has excelled in it. And so I'm just fascinated by her, particular angle on it, which is pretty non-traditional but very effective. And Marissa, I won't steal your thunder. I'll let you go into that. But someone that grew up with a spiritual family, they had military parents, growing up during wartime, looking at things a little bit differently. I was always showered with all those type of philosophies, right? And so Marissa has an integrated approach where she takes some of these more Eastern philosophies, I've noticed, and integrate them into Gallup strengths. And so, it's this kind of Eastern Western logical and, whole human-centered approach to helping folks, really go a lot further than just the academic portion of training, whether it's personal development or anything else. And so, we reconnected, and I'd love to dive into that story. We reconnected after I left Rackspace. We both worked at that was a company we both worked at. And I went to work for the community college. And it was a big career jump. I wanted to get into community building work. It was always a passion of mine. There was an opportunity that opened up. And anyways, I had the opportunity to work with Marissa on some integrated professional development work using strengths as a center for individuals that were going through technical training programs on a program that I was hired to run there.
Marissa, that's a great, Sean's just doing my job for me. That's a great segue. Let's talk a little bit about this strength-based performance skills curriculum. You referenced it early. Give us a quick overview of it, and then let's kind of dive into some success that you're having with it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, about the program itself?
Yeah.
Yes, of course. Well, I mean, to piggyback on what Sean was explaining, exactly. Sean was as a director for the local communities, local junior colleges organization. He did something pretty impressive. I mean, I don't want to talk about your vision, Sean, of how you, because Sean actually supplemented a grant-based program and brought soft skills, that was not the original plan. Was that right, Sean?
Yeah, to be specific, so it was a Department of Labor program called America's Promise, and what they did is they funded it through H-1B applications, and the whole spirit of it was to create training programs for dislocated workers, and by that I mean they lost their jobs through either no fault of their own or whatnot, right? And so, and for underemployed folks that might have had a degree in something that wasn't a match for what they were doing today. So they would qualify to go through these programs, and it was pretty expensive, $2,000 to $3,000 per person to either learn, computer coding or software development or administration or cybersecurity. I don't want to go down the rabbit hole too far, but in the back of my mind, I could never forget the impressions of working for our previous company. And how what they would do is they would hire for aptitude. They would hire for aptitude. They would put folks through what they call their company university, but they would layer and integrate this strengths approach. And there were some really impressive folks that would come through, and within a couple of years, they would become principal technicians, and they would be managing large accounts and solving problems for customers that were running huge commercial websites. So I couldn't get off the fact that, look, we need to figure out how to integrate this program. So I'll just be brief. I got shot down at the Department of Labor, who funded us, got shot down through some different levels at the community colleges. And not because there wasn't a belief that we shouldn't integrate this type of programming, positive psychology, strengths-based, professional development into technical training. It was just, there's rules and regulations and red tape that allow just certain funding to do certain things. So in short, after knocking on a lot of doors and just obsessing over it, and this is really one of those connectedness stories, my neighbor next door down the hall, he was running a program. He was trying to find some funding too. So we put our heads together with some other folks, and we reached out to a large employer in San Antonio. We made the pitch. And my pitch was that we would put every student that goes through this program through a strengths module. It'd be custom made. It'd be owned by the colleges. And, we had to back it up with some white papers. And we actually got a lot of support from Department of Labor. And then they hooked us up with somebody with the International Economic Development Forum, created a presentation, a lot of documentation. Academia likes that. And then they said, okay, you're cleared to go pitch on our behalf. And we got some funding. And so what it did is it paid for the curriculum development, the programming, training for a few folks at the college to provide, auxiliary services to students that wanted additional one-on-one coaching. And it really did become a success. And so, part of today's storytelling around that, it also will end up really as a call to action to show other municipalities, states, or workforce boards that it could be a missed opportunity not to look at integrating the whole person experience into learning and bringing in strengths and other types of soft skills that prepare folks for especially these 21st century jobs that require technology and our ability to use our human creativity and high human potential to create a lot of leverage and productivity in these type of service-oriented jobs. So I was a little long-winded, but it gets me excited because I see the potential just nationwide, worldwide, especially as we recover through this pandemic and we transition to a different economy.
Sean, I think it's important, that end of the story, though. So Marissa, thank you for letting Sean talk about that a little bit, because it's those, like, we can have the greatest ideas in the world, but if they don't get funded, they don't find a home to actually get deployed into. They never happen. And so I think that's an equally important part of it. Marissa, we'll bring it back. Everybody's wondering, okay, what is this? Like, what did you develop? So dig in a little bit, talk a little bit about the program.
Of course. Thank you. Sure. So what we did is I developed a curriculum that would prepare IT professionals to re-enter the workforce with our certification. So with the great support of Sean, we went back and forth. I developed 3 modules. The first module, it was Introduction to Positive Psychology and Strengths. The typical, they would take their assessment prior to coming to class, all of that. And from the positive psychology agreements to the different reports, reading the report, naming, claiming, name, the basics. That was the first module to kind of introduce him to strengths. And then I transitioned into module number 2, and that was strengths-based communication skills. This is something very important, not just for IT professionals, but the more we connect digitally, sometimes the less we're able to connect with people and know how to manage conversations in an effective way. So this was communication skills in the digital era. So it was very specific, even though it was 2018, it was still very specific to social media, the internet, the reality. How is it that you manage yourself, as a professional online? And we, to Sean's point on the ancient wisdom traditions that I totally appreciate. And thank you, Sean, for calling out on my connectedness and the cosmic nature of my work. But we both agreed that we both love the book, The 4 Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. I actually remember asking Sean, hey, have you read this book? And sure. So we went, down the rabbit hole of both of our inputs on the 4 agreements. And I integrated that book into, how to use your strengths to practice the 4 agreements. Right. So it's very, this is the way I like to do curriculum and do strengths. It's like, let's do something with your strengths, even, after you just learn what they are and you're just learning the themes, but guide those, facilitate those conversations. And then the third module, that was really the heart, was a strengths-based career management. And I would divide the module into 4 by the 4 domains of talent, pretty much the 4 functions. So execute, and I connected to productivity, right? And I would leverage, other books. I leverage this, GTD, Getting Things Done by David Allen, a system that I'm very familiar with, and how to, become more productive through your strengths. And of course, we would get into, you don't have to have executing talents to aim them. You can aim a relationship building strength to executing and productivity. So influencing, I connected to job interview, salary negotiations in the digital era. I leverage amazing thought leader in the world of HR, Liz Ryan, from the Human Workplace, someone I admire and follow on LinkedIn, because I think she just rocks. And we would engage in these conversations on, like, your social media is your resume online. How are you conducting yourself, right? LinkedIn, Glassdoor, being mindful of what you're doing on your Facebook, on your Instagram. Employers are looking at this, right? Because again, we were working with students, participants, a lot of them non-traditional students, that were reinventing themselves. So this was a very interesting component of the applicability of the delivery of this curriculum. Finally, relationship building, I connected to the concept of personal board of directors. So we would leverage another book by local author, Lorenzo Gomez, and the name of the book is The Cilantro Diaries, and even students will get a copy of the book. And it was about the importance of our relationships and creating a personal board of directors concept. Because we're all entrepreneurs, right? The startup of you, which is something that other concepts I incorporated into the module was that from the LinkedIn founders, we are all managing our careers. So we talked a lot about that, and of course, in strategic thinking was about critical thinking, right? How do we foster critical thinking? And I would leverage some other materials from TED Education to foster these conversations with the participants. So it got pretty nerdy, it got pretty geeky, and of course, these are geeks, so it was totally up in their alley, and it was great. I I got to deliver it to all 130 participants in 10 different cohorts through community partners, through organizations that that were involved in the process. And it was amazing. Each cohort was a different universe. It's a blessing as a trainer and facilitator to facilitate the same curriculum for several times. That's, for me, that's a blessing now that I'm a consultant, because you can perfect, right? You can polish up, and you become, so knowledgeable of what comes next that you can, for me, it was so much easier to facilitate and go with the flow. And of course, it's whatever the students brought as well, right? I mean, that's another huge component of this success story is, the reason why, my connectedness connects to, how Sean had the vision to bring in something soft skills, which is even a word that I stay away from. That's why I call that performance skills. Because, in the world of IT, no one wants to be soft, so it's like as if it's less important, yet it is of utmost importance nowadays that we are so disconnected in person and only connected through devices. For us to be able to read body language, to be able to be mindful of what comes out of our mouths, how we communicate, what are the words we choose to express ourselves, has become, I think, that there's this micro awareness that comes with the technology that we have today. So that was, in a nutshell, the 3 modules of strengths-based performance skills. And again, I delivered it for in a day and a half, and then I was able to compact it and deliver in a full day of strengths training, and it was awesome. What can I say?
Now that sounds great. I love how you connected to the 4 domains. And I love this idea also, because 4 or 5 are influencing for me. So I feel like maybe I'm an influencing expert at this. Maybe I'm
Of
not.
course.
Maybe I am. But that idea of personal brand too, you didn't say it that way, but I'm sure as you think about it in job hunting, right, you're creating this idea of personal brand. One of the modules in Gallup's onboarding kind of documentation is a whole unit on personal brand. And what does it mean? And who do you represent? And who do you say you are? You alluded to that with, we are who we post on social sometimes, right? And so what is that representation of that, and how are you living those out? Sean, would you add anything to that? You saw it from the outside as she was doing this. Anything you want to add?
Well, I wanted to dig in a little bit on the participants. I think it's important for us to talk about this because it's happening across the country right now. We're in a pandemic. That pandemic is putting a strain on the economy, and we've seen unemployment numbers rise into double digits and back down, God willing, to the single digits for larger cities, but it's up in the higher single digits, and we're still trying to figure all this out as a society. But one thing that's occurred is there's been a pretty large cash infusion that's gone out to major cities and to states for a recovery for this pandemic. Now, what we're looking at is something that's being funded at scale that's been happening for the past several decades, even when times are good, and that's that funding goes into local workforce boards or through state workforce commissions. And then there's grant writing activities that create programming so that folks that need that assistance to get over some financial barriers or need wraparound services so that they can focus on getting into their technical training program, in any industry that they choose. That funding has always been available, but now it's not only available at scale, but it's being experienced by, hundreds of thousands of ordinary Americans, some of which never saw themselves in this particular situation before. You compound all of that. I know it's a lot. You compound all of that with the fact that, we were already on this path, but because of this pandemic and because of working from home, and everybody's just, human ingenuity is at a green light right now. Whatever we could do to keep working, we're going to do it, but we're going to stay safe. But what that's done is that's accelerated technological advances that are, going to all the way of automation and consolidating services and integrating. And, that's creating new jobs, but that's not what we're thinking about. We're thinking about the immediate pain, when that Band-Aid's ripping off, is that folks are losing their jobs or they're being forced to train for new ones. And unfortunately, myself included, I went to public school. Unless we had the privilege of being surrounded by, I'm fortunate to have great parents, and they had friends that provided a really solid kind of influence as I grew up. But not everybody has that, and that's where you get your self-actualization. That kind of puts you on the path, and kind of not. The 4 agreements covers it pretty well. I think it's, be impeccable with your word. Don't take anything personally. Don't make assumptions. Always do your best, right? Some people are fortunate to have those concepts, whether it's through that book or just in general, infused at an early age. And so it's easier to get new skills when you have that level of confidence. You know where you're coming from, so you know where you're going, right? But being completely transparent, because of the way that our school system is set up and the hustle of our society, I think some of that stuff gets pushed to the side. And to your point earlier, Marissa, about soft skills, and we need to change that word. You're right. I think they need to be essential skills, because what's happening now with all of this activity going on, and with what people like to call the fourth industrial revolution, just digitization and service-based economy, pushing tech into all industries. What makes us innately human is now the most valuable skill set on the planet, because everything else gets streamlined, gets automated, and it frees up our brains for more creativity, judgment, discernment, problem solving. That all stems from critical thinking. But if we don't know enough about ourselves, and we don't know enough about just the general all the components that make people human and drives those human talents that are really ahead of the economy right now, how are we going to work effectively with other people? How are we going to know, and how are we going to use discernment, really understand, what motivates people, how they think, how they relate to others, how we relate to others, how we relate to ourselves, how they influence others, what's their work style, and whether we're managers or we're coming up the ladder and we're trying to chase that job. Understanding that is a critical component to, one, career exploration, which is a huge theme right now amongst, whether it's children that are thinking about what they want to be when they grow up, to adults that are reinventing themselves, to executing on that plan and aiming your strengths. And it all ties in together. And so I kind of got lost in my train of thought, but I know it has to do with what you're asking around why does this all matter, right? And so what I see is a very important opportunity for us as a society to have a mainstream conversation about the importance of these things too, and what it means to become a fully integrated person. And now we're, it's not so academic in nature, and now we're hopefully not talking about putting all the funding into technical skills training, although important. Those technical skills training, let's be honest, most technical skills, unless you're an artist or you're doing something very personal, they have a diminishing rate of return. But what makes us powerful as human beings does not, and it actually has an increasing rate of return. And so this is just an opportunity to share a story, and also a call to action on how we can maybe reconsider the way we're funding these programs, because they're here to stay. The city, voters, about 70% or more of voters, just passed a proposition in San Antonio a few weeks ago. For the next 4 years, it's going to put about $70 to $80 million a year into workforce development programs to help folks get over those barriers, some caused by the pandemic, some caused just by the changing economy. So it's interesting to take this program that we worked on a couple years before all this happened,
Mhm.
and now see that it's more relevant than ever. So, just thanks for letting us come on and talk about it today.
Yeah, Marissa, I want to ask you, you've got some very concrete results on this
Mhm.
program. Sean, thanks for that overview. I think it's inspiring, by the way. Or early in the program, someone had mentioned in the chat room, like, I so want to do this, but there's so much red tape. And even in your story, it sounds easy now, but I'm sure you went through a ton to get there. So,
Mhm.
Marissa, what are some results? What did you see come out of the backside of this as you did this training?
Sure. Well, I think it was a successful program. Alamo College's district, finished very pleased with what we sent to the grantor, including a lot of comments from participants that documented their feedback after training, but even during training. Even just in my interaction with them, um, it was such a blessing for me to see the journey and be able to jumpstart strengths journey for 130 San Antonians reinventing themselves in their careers. And again, many of them were not necessarily your traditional college age, quote unquote, participant. I had immigrants that had arrived from the Middle East with a solid career and learning English and reinventing themselves through some software development, new career. I had women who were now grandmothers, and they needed to provide better to support their grandchildren, and needed to be parenting, later in life, and they wanted to be coders, and they got on it, and they were extremely passionate about becoming the change they want to see in the world. I had an attorney. I had an attorney that left his practice after several years, and he was totally burnt out as a successful attorney. He was a partner in the firm, and he decided one day, I'm not going to do this anymore because I am not. He had 4 strategic thinking in his top 5, and he was just like, I'm done with this. I am overburdened. I'm going to reinvent myself. I'm going to become a software developer. And he went through software development technical training as an attorney, as a JD. And his reaction towards his report, immediately he said, this makes perfect sense. This gives me the awareness that this is the missing piece for me. Of course, I had this issue with myself, like, how am I going to abandon after law school, and after the sacrifice of passing the bar and everything. And I'm going to totally give that up to reinvent myself. So very different stories, very different realities about these students. Again, some of my students in the most underprivileged parts of San Antonio, I had to bring coffee and pastries and fruit trays to class, to make sure that they had something in their stomachs, because I had some students that struggled so much financially, but they were there, in class, not missing class, reading their signature theme reports, as pre-work, and coming back to, okay, this is what resonated with me, and incredible questions, incredibly honest questions about, of course, positive psychology. I mean, completely blew their minds. They've been focusing on their weaknesses all their lives. And in a way, that's what got them there, and then they come here and like, what? There's nothing wrong with me. And so, I mean, I really think like what are the positives that came out is that besides, and the client being pleased and we got the numbers, ho, 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 that was fine. It was really more amazing conversations with the participants on how they were reinventing their lives completely, and how bringing strengths to them was a lot more than just getting that technical certification, but now seeing themselves in a different light, understanding, to your point, Jim, this is so huge, like your personal brand, understanding that your career is in your hands, and you're going to drive that, and you are a business, your person is a business, and we are entrepreneurs by nature. We've been exchanging goods and services since we were in caves, right? And engaging in that conversation and getting them on LinkedIn and getting them to behave on social media and like, stop that crap, sorry, but you need to be professional, and you need to, like you're part of the workforce and we need you and we need to transform San Antonio. And you love it here. Well, me too. So, we all need to grow together. We need to elevate our community. And that's, for me, that's really the biggest, golden, I was a golden coin of the whole experience, was experiencing that process with I don't want to call them my students, because I feel that I was not really their teacher, but just their coach, their facilitator, growing with them. And absolutely, there was a ton of red tape. Oh yes, I mean, I think it required patience. That's really in retrospect. Now I think about it and I laugh. At the moment, I was like, like I did pull my hair a few times. But I, in retrospect, it was just patience. It was just letting things run its course. What a connectedness statement of my part. But just letting things flow, right, and giving my very best. Once you're in the classroom, once you're in the training room, and you're on stage, you are the one. You know what I'm saying? It's my voice on the microphone, right? And it was my opportunity to let's engage in this amazing conversation that I hope you remember for the rest of your life. I don't want you to think about a class. Like this is like, an intervention, this is a life intervention we're going to get into. And so those are some of the stories and some of the things that I feel in retrospect were the pearls of the experience.
I just wanted to make, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Sean, go ahead.
Well, I did want to make one comment too, just to speak in the language of folks that might be listening today, and maybe they're running similar programs, or maybe they're on the side of influencing where these funds go, whether they're at an executive level or they're at a more middle stage governmental level, but they have the ears of maybe elected officials and other administrators. Is that one of the big key metrics, as they'll know, is completion rates. It's always a big key metric for these kind of programs, because if we're that's kind of the starting line in understanding how valuable is this program that we're spending taxpayer money potentially on, right? Is to what degree can they be completed? And I think average completion rate targets are usually somewhere between 70 and 80% on these programs. And Marissa, if you don't mind, I mean, maybe just share some of your insight on how this program has impacted completion rates alone.
Well, and I'm sorry, I may not have the stats right in front of me. I remember we shared in preparation for this call. But yes, I mean, one of the questions we asked in the post-training feedback survey was, do you feel eager to apply what you learned in this training in your career? And do you think that this is, helping you in your career? And, we got like, in the 89%, 90% of participants were like, absolutely, yeah. Was that right?
It was around 90, which isn't perfect, but to me that's a significant increase from what you normally see. I saw a lot of stuff between the 60s and 70s, with similar programs, and so just some of the ROI based on completion rates alone, when these metrics are looked at, it's worth considering. And then job placements naturally are higher, but that could be a whole other podcast.
Hey friends, this is the part of the program that we call the lightning round. We've got questions coming in from the chat room. We won't be able to spend too much time. I do want to get to a few of them because they're good. So let's we'll have to roll through this piece. But Crystal had asked, do you have any special tips? Marissa, we'll start with you. Do you have any special tips for introducing the concept of positive psychology strengths to skeptics? I'm sure both of you had this, so I'll let you both in. But Marissa, you any tips on when folks?
Sure, that's just the stats. All I did was, in module 1, and when I have that type of challenge sometimes to the audience, from the get-go, I start with the Gallup number. So what research says, what are the KPIs that increase tremendously from engagement to sales to profit by a group having a strengths intervention. So what I do is it's not me. I'm not the one doing the research. I cannot even keep up with a spreadsheet. It's Gallup, so I'm very good at making that distinction. That I am not saying is, the best thing No, it's the numbers. Like if you can bring another tool, another instrument of its kind that is also research based and that is scholarly approved that have these numbers, then sure, I'm happy to engage in that conversation. But of course they can't. So I think just research, just show the numbers.
Good. Sean?
I would say positive psychology. I mean, first off, it honors the subjective, but it doesn't take the eye off the ball to the objective. And I think the killer app in positive psychology is that everything's an opportunity, right? Yeah, sure, problems and whatever, they're there, but they become an opportunity, right? And so it increases long-term thinking, and long-term thinking is what we all need. But in order to get there, we need to learn how to find common ground, and positive psychology helps advance that. So organizationally, it just makes sense. In a family, it makes sense. Amongst friends, it makes sense. If it becomes a dominant part of our culture, I think it could change the world.
Yeah, I think well said. Justin asked a question to Marissa. How long did it take you to design the program? And we'll forgive us misspelling there. And what was the greatest challenge on creating it? I'm joking about the misspelling.
It's not misspelled. It's correct. Thank you for the question.
Yeah.
I would say it took me a couple of weeks to create this curriculum. And of course, I had a draft and I sent to Sean, right? And Sean and I, of course, we're geeking out about it for a little bit, and then I make a few other tweaks and send back to Sean, like, sure, maybe you want to do. I remember you, Sean, mentioning, balconies and basements. How about here? So it was awesome to be able to have a fellow, Gallup certified strengths coach help me develop the curriculum, and also that we had that connection in IT and we knew the sector and we know our community. So we really had in mind very much our audience. But of course, every time I delivered the course, I learned it was a lesson for me as well. So I was able, as I said before, to kind of perfect it. And each cohort of students would bring a different set of challenges to answer to the portion of what was the greatest challenge. And I would say the greatest challenge sometimes was uncertainty that I went through as to, not sure how soon we were going to have enough people to have another cohort, little things like that, and, when you work with a grant-based program, you have certain parameters that you have to work with. And, of course, I got a little nervous a couple of times about those things, but overall, it was a great experience, very positive experience. Working with our community partners and with Alamo colleges, was very positive.
Sean, don't worry, you get your own question as well. So Lisa asked, Sean, you did an amazing job of sticking with funding for your program. What strengths did you bring to that? How did you got to stay with this thing. So you can go outside your top 5 if you want. That's
Maximizer. I identify with Maximizer, and that's my number 6. I think that's what drove it primarily. But what kept me calm, and what always keeps me calm for the most part, is probably the individualization and the connectedness, right? It especially the connectedness, it helps me not give up, right? It makes me stubborn as a mule sometimes, but it helps me keep my confidence in maybe sharing the vision when you get knocked down and you fall flat every once in a while. But it's it's very similar to belief in a weird way. Even though my belief is much lower, the connectedness is a big confidence booster for sure. It keeps me going.
No, good to hear. As we do kind of final thoughts, I want to ask you this question. If you were to give one piece of advice, Marissa, we'll start with you. If you were going to give one piece of advice to somebody who is thinking about doing this in their city, what advice would you give them going in?
Oh, wow. What a great question. Well, I would say to think global, apply local. I would say to spend the time to develop the curriculum and any other pieces of the project, right? With really the audience in mind. Who are your students? And the slight differences that might be within that community. I think this is very much about, this is not a cookie cutter solution, right? But if you have in your community the opportunity to customize to really work for the needs of your learners and really address the needs of your learners, that's what works best, right? To meet the learner where they're at, and transform lives that way. That's what I would say. Just keep it as local, as relevant as possible.
I like it. Good. Sean, what would you give?
I mean, I think that's the key. And I would say never underestimate the power of private-public partnerships. That's what really helped get the funding in this particular case. But thinking locally is very powerful. Almost every city or town has proud employers or organizations that whose beliefs and culture align with investing thoroughly in people, right? And not just talking the talk. And so, aligning with those organizations and taking your time to really craft the vision and know that there's gatekeepers along the way. So the first no doesn't really matter. Just keep going, and keep the vision clear, and then just know when to move on, but really work on those partnerships, because especially we're talking about the public sector here, as our society ages, I mean, you just see the public sector borrowing more ideas from the private sector, and so the glue there are those partnerships, and there's an appetite for them on both sides.
We just did some internal training here at Gallup. I was recording some training, and the instructor said in some cases it takes 18 to 25 no's before you'll get a yes. Wow. And lots of people give up after 3. Mm-hmm. And so, Sean, to your point, I think if you want to be in this space, especially in the public sector, you're gonna face opposition. If you don't, you're doing something wrong, probably, or you're not doing something right. And 2, you're gonna probably take a lot of no's and a lot of frustration. So
yeah, and just to take a positive psychology approach to that, when you do get a no, you might uncover a new opportunity, a new way to serve.
Right on. Marissa, Sean, thank you for giving us an hour today to go through this. It's been great to get to know you through this process. This has been super fun for me to get to know you guys through
Likewise.
putting up the invite to our call this week. A real joy to spend time with you guys. So thanks for coming on. I appreciate it. You guys hang tight for me here for 1 second. We'll remind everyone to take full advantages of all the resources we have available now in Gallup Access. So if you're wondering, gosh, where do I get some great information on this? Head out to gallup.com/CliftonStrengths. And while you're there, sign up for the Clifton Strengths Insight newsletter. It comes out monthly. We just put one out the other day. At the bottom of the page, there's a newsletter sign up on every page at gallup.com. So get signed up there as well. If you're interested in coaching, master coaching, or becoming a Gallup certified strengths coach, like these individuals are here as well, send us an email, coaching@gallup.com. We can help you get through that. Stay up to date with all our webcasts by visiting gallup.eventbrite.com. Follow us there. You'll get an email notification whenever I post anything new. So follow us on any social platform just by searching Clifton Strengths. And we do want to thank you for joining us today. If you liked it, well, click the like button to begin with. And then second, share it. We'd love to have you share this around, not just locally, but around the world. Great opportunities to do that as well. We want to thank you for coming out today. With that, we'll say goodbye, everybody.